At my wife's office branch opening party, her arrogant boss mocked me as a handyman in front of everyone, never realizing I was the owner of the entire building. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a room when someone decides to humiliate another person in public. It is not the comfortable silence of people who simply have nothing to say. It is the other kind. The silence in which everyone seems to hold their breath at the same time because they can feel that a line has just been crossed. I know that silence well. At exactly 7:43 on a Thursday evening, I was standing in the middle of it, at the grand opening of the Buckhead branch of Meridian Strategic Consulting, inside one of the most expensive commercial buildings in Atlanta, Georgia. The catering was excellent, the champagne was cold, and the man behind the mahogany podium was my wife Rebecca's boss, Garrett Holloway. Garrett looked directly at me in front of nearly 200 people and spoke loudly enough for the microphone to carry every word across the room. "And this must be the husband. What is it you do again, Lucas?" "Right, the handyman." Then he laughed. A few people laughed with him, not because the joke was funny, but because people often laugh in uncomfortable moments when they do not know what else to do. I did not say a word. I simply looked at Garrett and smiled slowly without letting the smile reach my eyes. I allowed him to enjoy his moment because I already knew something he did not. Garrett Holloway was standing inside my building at a party my company had helped fund, surrounded by clients whose contracts had passed across my desk, in a city where my name appeared on more real estate transactions than his entire consulting firm completed in a year. I was not the handyman. I was the landlord. I was an investor connected to the funding behind his firm's expansion, and in several quiet ways that he was about to discover, I was one of the reasons he still had a place to conduct business. But to understand why I did not correct him immediately, you need to understand who I am, who Garrett was, and why I chose to let his words remain in the air. My name is Lucas Brandt. I am 39 years old, and I run a holding company in Atlanta called Brandt Capital Partners. I did not inherit the company, and I did not stumble into it through luck. I built it from a 2-bedroom apartment in Decatur, Georgia, beginning when I was 26 years old. At the time, all I had was a laptop, a line of credit that made my stomach tighten every month, and a stubborn belief that if I kept moving long enough, eventually something would work. By the time I met Rebecca, I was 31. The company was profitable, but nothing about my life looked flashy. I did not drive a car designed to announce my income. I lived in an understated townhouse in Virginia Highland that I owned outright, although most people assumed I rented it because it did not resemble the sort of house they expected someone in my position to own. I wore plain clothes and simple watches. I deliberately maintained almost no social media presence because I had spent enough time in business watching people use visibility as a substitute for competence. Rebecca was 29 when we met. She was a senior consultant at a mid-sized strategy firm downtown, and she was genuinely one of the sharpest people I had ever encountered across a conference table. We met during a panel discussion about commercial real estate development at the Georgia World Congress Center. Rebecca expressed several opinions about zoning law and mixed-use corridors that were intelligent, specific, and uncommon. I noticed her immediately, and after the panel, I asked her to dinner. 6 months later, we were inseparable. 18 months after that, we were married, in a small ceremony at Callaway Gardens with 40 guests, which Rebecca's mother considered dangerously close to eloping. One of the things I have always loved about Rebecca is that she never needed a detailed inventory of my assets to understand me. She was not incurious. In fact, she is one of the most intellectually engaged people I know. She simply had her professional world, I had mine, and we respected the boundary between them. She knew I operated a holding company. She knew I had investments in commercial real estate, private equity funds, and several operating businesses. She knew we were comfortable. What she did not know was the exact scale of those holdings, because I had never felt the need to walk her through every spreadsheet, and she had never felt the need to ask. That arrangement served us perfectly well, until Garrett Holloway decided to involve himself. Garrett was 52 years old and had served as managing partner of Meridian Strategic Consulting for approximately 7 years. He was the type of man who was never merely present. He was always performing, always auditioning for the role of the most important person in whichever room he happened to occupy. He was tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, and possessed a very specific kind of confidence. It was not the confidence that comes from achievement. It came from his willingness to interrupt people, speak over them, and assume no one would challenge him. Rebecca had worked at Meridian for 4 years. She was genuinely excellent at her job. She possessed the kind of competence that did not require performance, which made her valuable, and I suspected occasionally threatening to a man like Garrett, who needed to believe he was the smartest person in every room. Over the years, Rebecca mentioned him the way someone might mention the weather. Garrett thinks this. Garrett said that. Garrett decided something else. He was the weather system of her professional life, predictable in his patterns, occasionally disruptive, and requiring regular management. Before the Buckhead party, I had never given him much thought. That changed quickly. Meridian had been preparing the Buckhead branch for 8 months. The firm was expanding, and the office space it selected was located in a mixed-use development in Buckhead, a neighborhood with several different ways of reminding you that money has opinions. The building was a 19-story Class A commercial tower called the Hartwell on Peachtree. It featured floor-to-ceiling glass LEED-certified systems, underground parking, premium security, and the sort of polished common areas that allowed the property to charge premium rent per square foot while delivering something worthy of it. I knew the property well because the Hartwell was one of 17 commercial buildings held by Brandt Capital Partners. I owned it. I had owned it for 6 years, and it remained one of the acquisitions I was proudest of. I purchased it during a period when Atlanta commercial real estate was undervalued in ways the market had not yet recognized. I had spent 2 years studying corridor development patterns before most investors in my space began paying attention, and the property's performance had confirmed my judgment. 4 months before the opening, Rebecca told me over dinner that Meridian was launching a Buckhead office at the Hartwell. I told her that was great, and I meant it. I did not mention that I owned the building, because there was no meaningful reason to bring it up during dinner on an ordinary Wednesday evening. Rebecca knew I held commercial properties throughout Atlanta. The Hartwell was not a secret. It simply had never been a topic. On the evening of the party, I arrived after a late meeting in Midtown. I wore a dark navy suit that I had owned for 3 years and liked precisely because it was well cut without attracting compliments. I was not wearing a name tag. I avoid name tags at events unless someone physically corners me with a sticker. I entered quietly, without announcing myself, and began looking for the nearest drink. Rebecca was already inside, working the room with the charm, precision, and professional ease that came naturally to her. When she saw me, she gave me the particular look she uses at business functions, a look capable of communicating 17 separate messages in less than a second. I am glad you are here. Stay out of trouble. Do not make one of your dry jokes that people will fail to recognize as a joke. The office was beautifully designed. Meridian's fit-out team had real taste, and the main event space was warmly lit without feeling dim. Nearly 200 people filled the room: clients, partners, employees, vendors, and several figures from Atlanta's business community, whom I recognized, although I doubted any of them recognized me. I collected a drink, found a quiet corner, and watched the room, the way I usually watch rooms, patiently, attentively, and with no desire whatsoever to become the center of attention. That was when Garrett Holloway approached me. He moved with the energy of a man who had already evaluated a stranger and filed him under unimportant. His handshake communicated hierarchy rather than warmth. 2 people stood beside him, probably clients based on their body language, and Garrett carried the relaxed authority of someone who had convinced himself that everything in the room existed because of him. "You are Rebecca's husband?" he said. It was not a question, it was an identification, as if he were reading a label on a box. "Lucas," I replied. Right. He studied me with performative interest. "And what is it you do, Lucas?" In most situations, that question is a harmless social ritual. Someone asks what you do, you answer, you return the question, and the conversation continues. Garrett was not asking it that way. Certain people ask what you do as a sorting mechanism. They are not interested in your work. They are calculating whether you deserve their next sentence. "I work in investments," I said. It was simple and true. "What kind?" "Primarily commercial real estate and private equity." He nodded with the expression of a man who had decided investing was something people claimed to do when they had failed to enter a respectable MBA program. Then he turned slightly toward the clients beside him, already redirecting his attention after determining in less than a minute that I was not a valuable use of his time. Good, good. Well, it is a great party. Enjoy yourself. Then he moved on. I watched him leave and took another sip of my drink. I felt no particular anger. People like Garrett have always existed, and I have always found it easy not to care what they think of me, because their opinions are not calibrated to reality. They are calibrated to appearances. I had spent most of my professional life deliberately refusing to perform for appearances. So I let the conversation go. I refilled my drink, found Rebecca spoke with several people I found interesting, and ate a few excellent hors d'oeuvres prepared by someone with actual skill. The evening was perfectly pleasant until Garrett stepped behind the podium. At approximately 7:30, he moved to the front of the room with the confidence of a man who had been anticipating the moment for weeks. He tapped the microphone, and the crowd settled. His speech was exactly the sort of speech people like Garrett deliver at corporate openings. It was filled with phrases about our vision, our growth, our incredible team, and the exciting future ahead. Most of it was harmless. He thanked the clients, he acknowledged the staff, he described the Buckhead office as though it had been created through the force of his ambition alone. Then, near the end, his eyes found me in the crowd. I have often wondered why he chose that moment. The most honest answer is probably that he did it because he could. He had an audience, he felt comfortable with that audience, and I was the one person in the room he had already decided did not belong on the same level as everyone else. To him, I was Rebecca's husband, the vague investment man who had not volunteered the name of his company. I was scenery. I also want to thank all the spouses and significant others who came tonight to support our incredible team, he said with practiced warmth. It means a great deal. He paused, smiled, and gestured toward the crowd. I even spotted one husband in the corner earlier who seemed to be trying to figure out what half this room does for a living. A small, uncertain laugh passed through the audience. Garrett leaned closer to the microphone. That must be Rebecca's Lucas. What was it you do again? Right, the handyman. The laughter that followed was uncomfortable. Half the people participating already knew they should not be laughing. I met Garrett's eyes and held them. Then I smiled slowly without showing my teeth. I did not speak. Garrett continued his remarks, and the speech ended soon afterward. The applause was genuine because Rebecca's colleagues were sincerely proud of the new office. Their happiness was real regardless of what Garrett had done. Rebecca reached me less than 30 seconds after he stepped away from the podium. Her face held embarrassment, anger, apology, and a slight concern about what I might do next. Luca, I am so sorry, she said. He does that sometimes. He thinks it is funny. It is not funny. I am sorry. I placed my hand gently on her arm. It is fine. It is not fine. It is going to be fine. Let us stay another hour. You should enjoy your party. She studied me with the expression of a woman who knew that when I became the calmest person in the room, immediately after being insulted, it was usually worth paying attention. What are you thinking? She asked quietly. Nothing yet. That was true. I was still collecting information. I do not make decisions while trapped inside a feeling. I make them when my mind is clear and the correct path becomes obvious. We stayed for another 45 minutes. I shook hands, smiled at the appropriate moments, and ate a small piece of very good chocolate ganache cake. I did not approach Garrett. I did not tell anyone who I was. I did not mention what I owned. For the remainder of the evening, I remained Rebecca's husband, the handyman, standing quietly near the edge of the room. When we left, the valet brought me my 4-year-old black Audi A6. I drove it because I liked driving it, not because of what it communicated. I tipped the valet well, pulled onto Peachtree Road, and drove home. By the time we reached Virginia Highland, I had already begun arranging several calls in my head. Garrett did not know that Brandt Capital Partners was the Hartwell's primary ownership entity. He did not know that Meridian's 7-year lease for 3 full floors of Class A office space had ultimately been negotiated through my property management company. He did not know the lease contained standard commercial clauses requiring the owner's approval for tenant alterations, signage, common area modifications, and several categories of fit-out work. He did not know that Meridian's anchor client for the Buckhead branch, Cumberland Freight Solutions, had been introduced through a mutual contact who quietly served on the advisory board of one of my portfolio companies. He also did not know that the capital infusion supporting Meridian's expansion had come through a venture fund in which I had been a limited partner for 3 years. I did not control the fund, and I had never attempted to activate or leverage that position. I invested because the fund's thesis was sound. I do not normally use my resources to destroy people who have been rude to me. That is not how I operate, and I do not consider it a responsible use of money influence or character. Most of the time when someone underestimates me, I let it pass. Their mistake costs me nothing, and correcting it would teach them nothing. I have never been interested in proving myself to strangers. But there is a difference between being underestimated and being deliberately humiliated in public. There is a difference between a stranger who assumes you are unimportant and a man who uses a microphone in front of your wife's colleagues to turn you into the punchline of a joke. One is ignorance. The other is a choice. Choices have consequences. I waited 3 days before making my first move. I used those days to ensure that I was thinking clearly rather than reacting from irritation. I wanted whatever I did to be proportionate and purposeful, not merely satisfying. On Sunday evening, I called Derek Ashford, the Director of Commercial Operations for my property management company. Derek had worked with me for 9 years and was one of the sharpest operators I knew. I asked him to conduct a complete review of Meridian's lease compliance at the Hartwell. I wanted every clause examined, every documented approval located, every missing approval identified, and every fit-out item checked against the requirements in the lease. I was explicit that the review had to be done properly and by the book. It was not to be treated as a weapon. It was legitimate due diligence that should have been completed regardless. Derek called me back on Tuesday. "Do you want the good news or the better news?" he asked. "Start wherever you like." Meridian completed the Buckhead fit-out without obtaining approval for 7 alterations involving spaces adjacent to the common areas. That is a material breach of Sections 12 and 14 of the lease. They also installed exterior signage facing Peachtree without completing the required approval process. Their internal team probably assumed it was covered by the general build-out authorization, but it was not. I allowed the information to settle. What is remedies? Under the lease, we issue written notice and provide a 30-day correction period. If the tenant fails to comply within that window, ownership can cure the violations at the tenant's expense or pursue the additional remedies defined in the agreement. Send the notification, I said. Use standard procedure. No threatening language and no unnecessary tone. State the breaches and the correction period. Done. Anything else? One more thing. Schedule an owner's walkthrough of the Hartwell. I have not conducted one personally since the acquisition. I think it is time. Derek understood immediately. He did not ask any unnecessary questions. I will arrange it. What happened next was not part of my original plan. 3 days after Meridian's legal team received the lease notification, Garrett decided to involve Rebecca directly. He did not call her to apologize for his behavior at the party. He did not allow the lease issue to move through the proper legal channels. At 11:15 on Wednesday morning, he called Rebecca's personal cell phone and said in substance, "Your husband needs to get his people under control. Whatever this lease situation is, it is a nuisance and I expect it to disappear." Rebecca called me immediately afterward. Her voice was extremely even, which is how she sounds when she is furious and choosing every word with care. "Garrett just called me," she said. "He wanted me to tell you, and I am quoting him, that this lease business is a nuisance and he expects it to disappear." I remained silent for a moment. "He said that to you? He called my personal phone. He told me to handle my husband." Rebecca is a patient and deeply professional woman. She had spent 4 years managing Garrett's moods, arrogance, and disruptive behavior with grace. But there was a line, and calling her privately to instruct her to manage her husband was approximately 8 miles beyond it. "Okay," I said. "Okay," she repeated. "I have scheduled a walkthrough at the Hartwell. I would like you to attend if you want to." There was a pause. When Friday morning at 10, another pause followed. Lucas, what are you doing? The walkthrough that should have happened 6 months ago, that is all. I would simply like my wife to be there. She was quiet for a moment. Then I will be there. I arrived at the Hartwell at 9:45 on Friday morning. I was dressed the way I dress when I intend to be recognized. A charcoal suit, a white shirt, without a tie, and my good shoes. Derek was already present with 2 members of the property management team and Sandra Okafor, our commercial real estate attorney. Sandra handled all lease matters for Brandt Capital Partners and was the most composed person I had ever seen operate in a room filled with tension. Rebecca arrived at 9:58. She was dressed for work, sharp and professional. The look she gave me communicated that she still did not know exactly what she had walked into, but she was prepared to see it through. At 10:02, the elevator doors opened and Garrett Holloway stepped out. He had brought 2 people with him. The first was Meridian's Chief Operating Officer, Priya Nair, whom I recognized from LinkedIn and who appeared to possess significantly more practical intelligence than her boss. The second was Meridian's in-house counsel, Carson Webb, a young man who looked as though he had spent the previous 48 hours sleeping badly. Garrett's expression changed the moment he saw me. He had clearly expected a meeting with a property manager. Instead, he had walked into a situation that did not fit the narrative he had created. He looked at me, then Derek, Sandra, Rebecca, and finally the nameplate Derek had placed beside the conference room door. Brandt Capital Partners Building Ownership Meeting. Sandra stepped forward and offered her hand. Mr. Holloway, I am Sandra Okafor, legal counsel for Brandt Capital Partners. Thank you for making time this morning. Garrett shook her hand while visibly recalibrating. Yes, of course. Then he looked at me. And you are? Lucas Brandt, I said. I own the building. The silence that followed was one of the most complete silences I have ever experienced. Priya's expression immediately became professionally neutral, the look of a highly intelligent person who had just understood exactly what kind of morning lay ahead. Carson looked down at the floor. Derek stared at nothing in particular, which is what he does when working hard, not to reveal that he finds something amusing. Garrett's face passed through several emotions in rapid succession. None appeared comfortable. You own the Hartwell on Peachtree? I do. I have owned it for 6 years. Your firm has occupied space here for 8 months. I gestured toward the conference room. Shall we sit down? What followed over the next hour and 40 minutes was not, at its core, a confrontation. It was a business meeting. Sandra reviewed the lease notification with precision and without hostility. She identified each violation, cited the applicable lease language, explained the 30-day correction period, and described what the ownership team required to resolve the issues. Derek presented the supporting documentation. Carson took notes with the intense concentration of a man who knew he would need every one of them later. To Garrett's credit, he did not say anything else foolish during the meeting. He listened, occasionally asked a procedural question, and appeared to conduct a rapid series of internal calculations about what everything meant, how he had reached that point, and what response would create the least additional damage. Early in the meeting, he looked once at Rebecca. Whatever he saw in her face made him look away. Near the end, after Sandra had covered every procedural item, Garrett cleared his throat. Mr. Brandt, he said. His voice had changed. The performative confidence was gone. What remained was simply a man trying to locate solid ground. I would like to address something. I understand there may be context here beyond the lease matters. There is only business context, I replied. That was true. The meeting was procedurally legitimate. I had fabricated nothing, exaggerated nothing, and used no personal feeling to distort a straightforward compliance issue. The breach notification stands, I continued. The correction period stands. Beyond that, I have nothing personal to add. Garrett nodded slowly. Of course. The meeting ended, and everyone began collecting their materials. Sandra caught my eye and gave me the smallest nod. From her, that meant the matter had been handled cleanly and correctly. Priya paused at the door and looked back at me with an expression of measured professional respect. It is a beautiful building, Mr. Brandt, she said. Then she left. Garrett was the last person to exit. He stopped in the doorway and looked first at me, then at Rebecca beside me. Rebecca, he began. Whatever he had prepared to say appeared to disappear. He nodded once and walked away. Rebecca and I remained in the conference room after everyone else had left. Atlanta's skyline stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, sharp and clear against a cold November morning. "How long have you owned this building?" she asked. 6 years. She absorbed the answer. "And you did not think to mention that when I told you Meridian was opening the Buckhead office here?" "It did not come up." "You knew I owned commercial property in Atlanta." She stared at me for a long moment, caught somewhere between exasperation and amusement. "Lucas, you allowed that man to stand inside your building and call you a handyman. He had more information available than he chose to use." "That was not my problem." Rebecca covered her mouth. At first I thought she was upset, then I realized she was trying not to laugh. She pressed her lips together, looked toward the ceiling, and failed. "You are such a strange person," she said. "I know." She reached forward and adjusted the collar of my jacket, a familiar gesture she uses when she wants to communicate something for which she has no immediate words. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not doing anything dramatic, for handling it properly. There was only one proper way." Meridian corrected every lease violation within the 30-day period. Its team managed the process professionally and without complaint. Priya Nair supervised the work, and it became obvious that she was the person inside the company who knew how to make things function. Cumberland Freight Solutions continued working with Meridian on the strength of the firm's performance. I did not interfere with that relationship, and nothing about Meridian's commercial position changed because of the meeting. What changed was Garrett. I know that only because Rebecca continued working with him and observed the difference. In the following weeks, he became quieter and more measured. The casual cruelty that had characterized his management style began to recede. The jokes made at other people's expense, the performative dismissals, and his habit of using authority to make others feel smaller did not vanish completely, but they became less frequent. In December, Rebecca received a substantial raise. She had earned it long before November. I am not claiming the timing was connected to the meeting. I am only saying the events occurred next to each other, and people may draw their own conclusions. I continued living as I always had. I drove the same Audi, wore the same plain watches, attended professional events as someone's husband, and stood quietly in corners observing the room. The important part of the story was never simply the satisfaction of watching Garrett discover who I was. It was the 3 days I waited before acting. It was my decision to use legitimate procedures instead of an emotional reaction. It was understanding that when someone humiliates you publicly, the most powerful response is refusing to let their words diminish you in the one place where it matters, inside yourself. Garrett attempted to make me smaller in a room filled with people. He failed not because I stopped him in that moment, but because my actual size had nothing to do with whether he could perceive it. He merely discovered later what he had been looking at. But the story did not end with the Hartwell meeting. Several weeks later, at 6:47 on a Friday morning, I stood at the Delta check-in counter in Terminal F of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Rebecca was a short distance behind me, speaking to her mother on the phone, as she did nearly every morning between 6:30 and 7:00. The call had started 3 minutes earlier and would probably continue for another 10. That was normal. Before walking to the counter, I told her I would handle our check-in and that she could take her time. I gave the agent our confirmation number. She entered it, studied the screen, looked at me, and then looked back at the screen. "Mr. Brandt," she said carefully, "I am showing one seat under this confirmation, business class on the 7:35 flight to Nashville." "One seat?" "Yes, sir. We booked 2 seats 4 days ago, one for me and one for my wife." The agent checked the original reservation and then reviewed the modification history. She handled the situation professionally and eventually turned the screen far enough for me to see. The booking had been modified 2 nights earlier at 11:22 on Tuesday. Rebecca's seat had been upgraded from business class to first class. My seat had been removed completely. I stood silently for several seconds, processing the information. "Is there another seat available on this flight?" "One seat remains in business class," she said. "There is also a first-class seat on the 9:15 departure if you would prefer to wait." Rebecca had made the original reservation. Meridian was holding a 2-day regional conference at the Omni Nashville Hotel. Partners and clients from throughout the Southeast would attend, and Garrett had been preparing for it with the same energy he devoted to anything involving an audience. Rebecca was scheduled to present a session on client development strategy. I planned to accompany her because Sunday's program included a gala dinner for spouses, and because Nashville in November was a pleasant place to spend a weekend. But someone had upgraded Rebecca and deleted me. I considered the situation for approximately 12 seconds. "What is available in first class on the 9:15?" I asked. The agent checked. "There is one seat. I should also mention that one Delta One seat remains available on the non-stop flight to Paris departing this terminal at 10:20 if your destination is flexible." I looked at her. Paris? Charles de Gaulle? The return flight arrives Sunday evening. Delta One, fully reclining seat. I owned a property in Paris's 8th arrondissement, a small 4-story building with 8 units that I had acquired 5 years earlier during a period of weakness in European commercial real estate. I had been meaning to conduct a proper operational review for 18 months. My Paris-based property manager, Isabelle Marron, was brilliant, efficient, and increasingly creative in the polite reminders she sent asking when I might finally visit. I thought about the deleted reservation. I thought about Nashville. Then I considered the first-class seat available to Paris on a Friday morning in November. Book it. What I did not know at the counter was that the Paris flight had 3 Delta One passengers connected in different ways to Meridian Strategic Consulting. One of them was now me. Another was Tyler Rouse, Meridian's 44-year-old co-founder and Garrett Holloway's business partner of 16 years. Tyler possessed significantly more operational judgment than Garrett, and far less interest in being the center of attention. That was probably why Rebecca always spoke about him with a degree of professional respect she never extended to Garrett. Tyler was traveling to Paris for a personal weekend before returning to Meridian the following Monday. I had no idea he was on the flight when I booked my seat. I discovered it approximately 40 minutes later in the Delta Sky Club while sitting with a coffee and my laptop. Tyler was standing near the coffee station 20 feet away. I recognized him immediately from Meridian's website, which I had reviewed several times during the preceding weeks. He noticed me at approximately the same moment. At first, his expression showed only vague recognition. Then he placed me. "You are Lucas Brandt," he said. I am Tyler Rouse." He offered his hand. "We have not been formally introduced, but I know who you are." "Likewise." He glanced around the lounge before looking back at me. "Are you on the Paris flight?" "I am." He absorbed that information. Then his expression changed. It became more direct and thoughtful, the way someone looks when they decide to stop performing and simply speak. "Do you have a minute?" We sat down. The conversation that followed was one of the most interesting I had ever had inside an airport. Tyler was not Garrett. He did not perform. He asked direct questions and listened to the answers with the attention of someone who intended to use what he learned. Within 5 minutes, he spoke without preamble. "I want to apologize for what happened at the Buckhead opening. Garrett told me what he said from the podium. I was in Tampa that week, so I was not there, but his behavior was not representative of how Meridian should operate or how I personally conduct business. I appreciate that." "The lease matter was also handled exactly as it should have been," Tyler continued. "Your team was professional, the violations were legitimate, and the resolution was fair." I told Garrett all of that after the meeting. What did he say? Tyler made a small, restrained expression. He said, "He did not realize who you were. Most people do not. That appears to be intentional." "It is." Tyler studied me for a moment. "May I ask you something directly?" "Go ahead." "Is there any unresolved issue involving the Hartwell? Anything about Meridian's tenancy or our relationship that you believe was not addressed properly? I am asking as co-managing partner because if a problem remains, I want to know about it and correct it." That was the right question. It was the sort of question that distinguished people who genuinely knew how to operate a company from people who merely performed the role of leadership. Tyler was not asking only because he feared liability. He wanted to know whether Meridian's relationship with its landlord had suffered damage, and if it had, he intended to repair it. No, I said honestly. Your team managed the correction process well. The outstanding items were resolved and the relationship is fine. He nodded and leaned back slightly. Meridian's lease at the Hartwell comes up for renewal in 14 months. I am aware. I would like to begin those discussions early, and I would like to handle them personally from our side. He paused. Not Garrett. I looked at him for a moment. That works for me. We flew to Paris in seats 2 rows apart. On Saturday evening, we had dinner at a restaurant in the Marais. During the trip, I learned that Tyler had once introduced Isabel to a mutual contact in European property circles. It was one of those small world stories that become inevitable when people remain in the same industry long enough. By Sunday, I had completed the operational review I had postponed for 18 months. I left with a clear plan for the Paris property's next 3 years, and the beginning of what would become a genuinely productive professional relationship with a man who understood how to conduct business correctly. When I returned to Atlanta on Sunday evening, Rebecca was already home from Nashville. She stood in the kitchen making tea when I entered. She looked at my luggage and then at me. You went to Paris. It was not a question. The flight was available. I needed to meet Isabel and review the property. Rebecca placed her mug on the counter. Did you know Tyler Rouse was on that flight? Not when I booked it. She studied me carefully for a long moment. What happened to my reservation? Rebecca was one of the sharpest people I had ever known. During her 2 days in Nashville, she had determined that the reservation change was not an accident. She did not know who had made it or why, but she understood the shape of what had happened. Someone connected to Meridian changed it, I said. I discovered the modification at the check-in counter. I do not know exactly who authorized it. She became completely still. Garrett, I did not confirm that because I could not prove it. What I knew was that the modification had been made through an IP address associated with Meridian's administrative network. Derek had identified that while conducting basic due diligence after I mentioned the incident. What I knew was that someone at Meridian had decided my presence at the Nashville conference was inconvenient. What I knew was that the attempt to remove me had failed. Rebecca lowered her eyes toward the counter, remaining silent for several seconds. Then she said, Tyler called me this afternoon. I waited. He offered me leadership of the Cumberland Freight Solutions account. It would include a title change. What did you tell him? I said. I needed time to consider it. She looked directly at me. He also said the conversation resulted partly from his trip to Paris. Neither of us spoke for a moment. What did you say to him about me? She asked. I told him you were one of the best consultants I had ever watched operate. Her eyes narrowed slightly. It was true, I continued. And it arose naturally while we were discussing Meridian's team. She held my gaze for a very long time. Lucas, she said at last, what you are the strangest, most infuriating, most quietly effective person I have ever met. Is that a problem? She crossed the kitchen, stood in front of me, and placed both hands against my face, the way she does when she wants me to understand that she means something completely. Take the promotion, I said. She did. 4 months later, Garrett Holloway left his position as managing partner of Meridian Strategic Consulting. Publicly, the departure was described as a planned leadership transition. Tyler Rouse assumed full operational control. Priya Nar was formally named Chief Operating Officer, which made perfect sense to anyone who had ever watched her work. Meridian's lease at the Heartwell was renewed for 10 years on terms favorable to both sides. Tyler's team negotiated directly with mine, and the entire process was completed with no drama and complete efficiency. Rebecca eventually became head of Meridian's Eastern Regional Client Development Division. She was good at the job in the way she was good at everything, without performance, without noise, and with the kind of quiet competence that made other people trust her judgment and want to follow her lead. I continued driving the same Audi. I continued wearing plain watches. I still attended parties, found a quiet corner, held a drink, and watched the room. The only difference was that when a party happened inside a building I owned, I occasionally introduced myself as the landlord, simply to observe what people did with the information. Being underestimated is almost always a gift. It is not a comfortable gift, and it is rarely one anyone would choose. But when someone dismisses you, they give you something without realizing it. They give you clarity. They reveal who they are, what they value, and how they behave when they believe no one important is watching. I was always watching. I simply was not always the person they believed I was. And in the end, that was the entire point.